Well, I want to get us started by seeing if we can agree on one obvious thing. I think we all agree with this, that everybody wants to feel good. I want to feel good, you want to feel good, we all want to feel good. But then think about this. Not only do we want to feel good, but if our desire to feel good is our strongest desire, then we're setting ourselves up for addictions. Well, how does that work? Well, last week I talked about the relationship between the second coming of Jesus and the problem with addictions. And I may have left some of you a little bit confused because this is a rather new topic for me. To some degree, it's still confusing for me. So I want to just spend a couple of minutes, not long at all, hopefully, and just reviewing what I said last week to get that clear in our minds so I can develop a couple of further thoughts today. 4 points that I want to just make very, very simply. Point number one, there's nothing wrong with wanting to feel good. Start with that. We were created by a God who is joy. We were designed by a God to feel his joy. So there's nothing wrong with wanting to feel good. That's point number one. We're not apologizing for wanting to feel good. But we are struggling when we want to feel good in any way that we can make that happen. That's when we start getting in trouble. And that's point two. God's idea of how to feel good is very different than our idea of how to feel good. Because I understand God's idea of how he wants us to know what the word joy means, wants us to be happy, wants us to feel good. He wants us to experience the reality that we're loved and to experience that so strongly that we have no greater desire than to love him and to love other people. That's a summary of the law according to Jesus. So we're to feel good when we know that we're loved and we know that we're able to love. And we'd love to feel good if we could be in a community of people where there's no tension, no problems, and we're all together alive in a world where there are no problems at all. Well, that isn't the case. Therefore, the way that we're designed to feel good, to follow this point, the way that God has created us to feel good, to live love, to live to love, and to live in a world without problems, that is simply unavailable to us in this life. There's not one Christian, no matter how mature, that every moment feels completely loved. Many mature people beyond my level of maturity know what it is to feel deeply loved, and I know what it is to feel deeply loved at times, but there's times I wonder, has he disappeared on the scene? Why is he not involved in my life in ways that I wish he were? So we're just not going to experience the ingredients of happiness that God designed for us in this life. So we're struggling. There's a desire in our soul that cannot be met. You recall what C.S. Lewis said, we all have an inconsolable longing, a rather large point. That's all point two. Point three, that leaves us frustrated, and it leaves us rather inclined to arranging to feel good in any way that seems to work. That can be for a bunch of people. It can be pornography, how much sexual addiction is going on. That can be just eating way too much. Nothing wrong with enjoying a good meal, but is it really a problem when we eat in order to medicate our pain and to obscure the difficulties that we feel? What we're really after in addictions, I want to get back to the word addiction now. What we're really after in addiction is the idea that I want to feel something now that blocks out everything that is difficult in my life, that blocks out a feeling of emptiness, that blocks out a feeling of frustration, that blocks out difficulties that I'm facing with health or finances or relationships. I want to feel something that blocks out everything negative. That's my strong desire. And if it's my strongest desire, I've been set up for addiction. That's point three. Point four, Paul seems to anticipate what I've been talking about. I'd like to think I'm getting this from the Apostle Paul, when in Romans 8:23, he says that we groan inwardly, and as a result of groaning inwardly, living in a world where we cannot have everything we want, we wait eagerly. Now that brings us to the big point of the second coming of Christ. To the degree that that's on our mind, I believe there's a way in which that preoccupation, waiting eagerly for the second coming, robs addictive desires of their strength. The second coming of Christ, when waited for eagerly, when that's fully on our mind, as it rarely is in our evangelical culture, I fear, but when that does happen, then I believe that there's a way that our addictive desires lose some of their controlling strength. Well, that's what I've been talking about in this past week, and now I got two thoughts to build on all that. Two thoughts that I want to share with you. First thought that I want to share little more on the academic side. The second one will be more personal and maybe a little more practical. But the first thought, I want to say it very briefly, is I believe our culture has become so psychologized that we've become de-theologicized. Is that a word? I just made it up. We become so committed to psychology as the answer to our problems that we don't seem to realize that theology, the Bible, the wisdom of God, the gospel of Jesus, might actually be speaking into the realities of our life, including addictions and everything else. Difficult marriages, raising your kids, struggles with depression, worried about finances, all the stuff that we deal with in this world that's a difficult place to live. Does theology speak into it? Do we go to a theologian with our struggles, or do we go to a psychologist with our struggles? Well, obviously we go to a psychologist, but why? Is there not a theological perspective that can make a huge difference that psychology can't make? That's thought number one. My burden since the time I finished graduate school and got disillusioned with psychology, not disillusioned with all of psychology, but disillusioned with psychology as a final answer to life struggles. It doesn't deal with the deepest issue. Something I've said for years, and I say it more strongly now than I ever have before. If you discover, now follow the sentence, if you discover a problem in your life that can be solved without appealing to the gospel of Christ, you haven't discovered the real problem. Think about that. If you discover a problem in your life that doesn't require the resources of Christianity to adequately address it, then you have not discovered the real problem. The real problem beneath addictions is a problem that the gospel speaks directly into with a power that psychology lacks. Thought number one. That's all I want to say about that. It's a big point to me. It defines my entire career, my entire life as a psychologist. I am a Christian psychologist, but I want to see that my psychology is informed by theology. I don't want my theology to be informed by psychology. Thought number one. Thought number two. And this is going to get just a little more involved maybe, and hopefully a little more practical though, even though it might be a little bit involved. If we're supposed to do everything, and the Bible teaches this, if we're supposed to do everything for the glory of God, now just stop with that, stop on that phrase. It's a very familiar phrase to us, do all things for the glory of God. It's all through the Bible. Does it really mean that? Am I to do everything for the glory of God? How about when I'm struggling with an addiction? Am I supposed to respond to that addiction in a way that actually reveals the character of God and makes known God and delights God and glorifies God in the middle of my addictive struggle? Or am I not thinking about that at all? So my question, to start the second thought that I want to develop for the next few minutes, am I more committed to getting over my addictions so I can feel better? Or am I committed to dealing with my addictions in a way that reveals the character of God in my life to other people? That to me is a rather large question. And I think that if most of us were honest, and I'd have to join the large group, saying that in whatever addictive struggles I've known all my life, I want to get over them for reasons that have very little to do with delighting God and have everything to do with not messing up my own life, because I want to feel good. That's just the way it works these days. So in order to understand then a little bit about what it means to wait for the second coming in a way that glorifies the Lord, that puts our entire faith in what he's up to, telling a larger story that's going to culminate an eternity of joy where we're going to feel good forever without any complications whatsoever. If we're going to be preoccupied with that and understand what it means to wait for that in the middle of addictive struggle, I want to appeal to one verse and make a few comments on it that I think enlighten me a little bit. It maybe might help you a little bit in thinking through what the connection is between waiting for the second coming and as a way of dealing with your own addictive struggles. Here's the verse. It's in James chapter 1 and verse 15. It's a very familiar verse where James puts it this way. Several translations have it differently, but one translation puts it like this: lust, when it has conceived, brings forth sin. Lust, not meaning only sexual lust, certainly that, but any desire, and listen to this, any desire that moves us away from God. Lust, when it has conceived, what does that mean? How is lust conceived? What is the conception of lust? But when it happens, something disastrous takes place. It brings forth sin. 3 words: lust, conceiving, and sin. I want to say very briefly of those 3 words, what it means to wait in the middle of all of those difficulties now. First, lust, a desire for something that I find appealing. a desire rises up within me, and it's not a worthy desire. It doesn't come from the Lord. It comes from the flesh. It comes from my sin nature, but I find it appealing. That's simply all the word lust really means, a desire, that I feel the desire and I go, yeah, I really kind of like that. What am I to do at that point? Well, typically I do nothing, and it goes off to where the lust then gets conceived. And by lust conceiving, the word conceive, the second word, I take it to mean this, that the desire, the lust, has inclined my will in the direction of satisfying that desire. The conception of lust is that something has happened within me where I feel inclined to move in the direction of satisfying that ungodly desire because I want to feel good. And if God isn't letting me feel good the way I want to feel good, then aren't I entitled to feel good? And I feel inclined then. I'm attracted to something that I shouldn't be doing, whether it's eating 5 donuts or whether it's watching pornography, the entire gamut of sinful desires. It gets conceived when we're inclined to move in that direction. We haven't moved in it yet, but when the inclination is there, when the appetite is there, it looks good to me, I'm inclined to do it. Let that germinate in your soul and in your mind, and pretty soon you're going to get into sin itself. You're going to watch the porn. You're going to have those 3 donuts you don't need, and you're going to be eating them angrily. Nothing's wrong with eating donuts. But if you're eating donuts angrily to say, I'm going to feel good now, and I don't care what's going on, I'm just going to enjoy this donut, and life stinks right now, and I haven't got any money, and my back is killing me, but 3 donuts, I'll feel better. You've actually gotten involved in an addictive process. So what do you do with that? What does it mean to wait for God in the middle of all that? Well, here's the brief response. Romans 12 and verse 2 tells us that transformation, the kind of change we really want. I don't want to be addicted to all the things that people get addicted to. I just don't want to live like that. So if I'm going to change, then Paul makes it clear that the essence of change is going to take part by renewing our mind. So what could my mind do when the lust arises within me? Well, as hyper-spiritual as this sounds, and maybe as ordinary and exciting as it sounds, how about praying? But what does the prayer look like at that point? The prayer of waiting for the second coming of Christ might look something like this, without being specific, but something like this. Lord, this desire that I'm wanting to gratify right now is not from you. The desire that you put in me is not going to be satisfied until heaven. I so look forward to that day. But this desire is not from you. Lord, teach me to hate this desire. It doesn't come from you. That's prayer number 1. How about when you don't do that, and then the lust gets conceived, and now you're inclined to go in the wrong direction that you really shouldn't be going on at all? Then what would prayer look like then? Maybe you could say something like this with preoccupation on the second coming. Lord, right now I got a battle going on in me between 2 wills. One part of me would love just to indulge this sinful temptation. It would feel so good, and I really want to feel good. But I have another will. I'm a Christian. I have the Holy Spirit within me, and I'd like to delight you. I'd like to honor you. And it would honor you, it would delight you if I wait for the satisfaction my soul longs for, because it's not available now in full measure. Taste of it now? Yes. Full measure? Not until heaven. Lord, I am eagerly waiting for the second coming. When that becomes the reality, then the conception, the inclination to want to go in a bad direction, it can become a little bit weakened with that kind of prayer. But suppose you don't pray that kind of prayer when you feel lust. You don't pray that kind of prayer when you're in the middle of the conception, and now you've sinned. Now, what kind of prayer do you pray now? What does transformation mean by renewing your mind to think biblically, to think gospel? How would you pray the third way? And something along this line, I suppose. Lord, I confess my sin. I really have said to you, God, that you're not worth trusting. I've said to you that the eternity you designed for me is not what I'm really interested in. That's really my core sin. Yes, watching pornography, eating the donuts, whatever it might be. Of course, that's sin, but the root is something very different. The root is looking at you and saying, you're not enough. I'm taking over my life. I'm going to feel good. Are we clear on that? Oh, God, that's what I've done. What a horrible thing. And I stand before you condemned, knowing that Jesus was condemned in my place. And that means I can groan now with all my failures and wait eagerly for the day of nothing but perfection and enjoyment and happiness forever and ever. Well, if that sounds like a formula, I've miscommunicated. Does it always work? Of course not. Nothing always works until we get to heaven. There's going to be struggles until we die. John Owen, one of the classic Puritans, wrote this in a book called Sin and Temptation. These are John Owen's words. Those who seek most for God experience the strongest opposition. How's that for encouragement? Those who seek most for God experience the strongest opposition. Is that good news at all? And my answer is yeah, but you got to be careful. In the middle of the strongest opposition, and you feel so weak, in my weakness, what does the Bible say? Maybe I can discover the strength of God. Maybe I can preoccupy with the second coming with a different level of eagerness in the middle of the battle that's raging within me. And to that degree, I believe it's possible to experience substantial, perfect no, but substantial victory over our temptations. That's thought number 2. Hope you ponder it. Hope you think about it. And I invite whatever comments or questions you might have after my discussion of those 2 thoughts.
Well, thank you, Larry. We're getting a couple of questions in, and I had one that kind of just hit me. You've oftentimes been misinterpreted. I think I've seen that in a lot of different ways, that people hear you saying something and they think that you're saying something that I'm sure you're not. You've talked about integration, the whole model of integration in psychology. You've talked about how theology and psychology are blended in that way, and you don't agree with that. Can you unpack that for just a little bit?
Yeah, the word integration got very popular about 30, 40 years ago when Clyde Darramore came along, and I think did a real service to the Christian church by saying that we can be Christians as psychologists. That was his basic thought, and I couldn't agree with it more. But then integration became very, very popular. The reason I don't like the word integration is it puts theology, the revelation of God in the Bible, and psychology, understanding of people from psychological research, it puts them at equal levels. Each have equal authority. So let's see where they blend and where our theological ideas don't blend with our psychological ideas. Would there ever be a time when we go with the psychological wisdom as opposed to the theological wisdom? If we integrate, that becomes a possibility. And I have a great struggle with that. I want to make sure that all that I do is I teach spiritual direction, my version of what psychotherapy really is, my version of counseling. My determination for the past number of years has been to put an evangelical basis under the way we counsel, the way we talk to each other, the way we spiritually direct each other. Because if we integrate, we're going to be prone to letting psychology get too much of a place and giving it too much authority. Does it have authority? Yeah, in a couple areas, sure it does. But theology always outranks psychology. So that's my response to your very important question.
Larry, do you have any book recommendations for us that really cultivate the idea of what heaven will be like in order for us to be able to kind of passionately wait for the second coming? Have you ever read a book that kind of stirred you in that way?
No. That's my answer. I think a book should be written in that direction. Randy Alcorn, who we got to meet one time at a conference, a wonderful man. I really enjoy him. And he has a book on heaven, which I think is the best book on heaven that I've read. But I'm not sure if, having read the book, that it got down to the core of what is really just appealing to me. And the best I can come up with, and I wish I could point you to a book on this, but I'm sure there is one, or I guess there might be, but I don't know it. But to me, the part that appeals to me the most to heaven certainly is not the typical nonsense about strumming harps while we sit on clouds. That's just an absurd kind of a caricature that's got popular over the earlier centuries. But the idea that every time I feel a struggle with sin, every time I feel a particular pain, I would love to not have that pain. I would love to not have that sin. And in this life, God wants me to learn to hate my sin more than I hate my pain. But I still hate my pain. I don't like feeling bad. I want to feel good. And I believe heaven is going to be an opportunity to be so overwhelmed with the presence of Christ. If we really love Jesus, if we really understand how bad our sin is and all that he had to do to deal with our sin, then we don't take the cross for granted, and we start realizing his love is beyond description. And the idea of seeing him face to face, what's going to happen then? We're not going to sin anymore because sin will be impossible. No. sin will be unthinkable when I see Jesus. I'm going to be so overwhelmed with the reality of his love for me that the idea of walking away from him in some form would be laughable. It would be like, you got to be kidding. Why would I walk away from him? That to me is the appeal of heaven for me. And I'm sure there's books that have said that far better than I just have, but if somebody knows what they are, I'd be glad to read it, but that's my thought.
If someone's a Christian and they're struggling with anxiety, with stress, and they're struggling a lot with those, should he or she avoid going to a psychologist to try to solve that issue? And I know you don't like the word solve, but where could a person like that go if they're interested in help?
Well, a couple of thoughts on that, but let me go back to the last question just for a moment. There is a book that I should have thought of. Urban Lutzer, Lutzer, former pastor of Moody Church, a man that I've come to know, and I have a tremendous amount of respect for Erwin. He's written a book that was titled 4 Minutes After You Enter Heaven. And that would be one book to consider reading. Lutzer writes very, very well. And that book has a lot of value to it. I should have thought of that before, but I didn't. So go back to your question now, Kep, the idea that, so where do we go when we have struggles? Is it wrong to go to a psychologist? Of course not. It's right to go to somebody who has some wisdom, some experience, some training. I have no opposition to any of that. But I'm very concerned that the wise thing to do is to go to a Christian psychologist, not to a psychologist who happens to be a Christian. A psychologist who happens to be a Christian is depending more on the psychological understanding than on theological insights. And when a person comes with anxiety attacks, I mean, I counseled for 10 years professionally as a psychologist, as a psychotherapist. And of course, people didn't come to learn how to glorify God. They came to get over their anxiety attacks, to get their depression lifted, to stop worrying so much, to be able to sleep at night when they're insomniacs, and all sorts, and bad marriages and all that. Well, of course I want to see marriage improve. Of course I want to see people sleep well. And if there's ways to think about that can advance living more effectively, more happily, if you will, I have no problem with that. But I want to make sure that the person you're talking to is somebody who knows that in the middle of whatever struggles that you have, because there are some struggles that are just not going to go away, what are you going to do then? You've got to find your roots in the larger story of God. You've got to find your perspective in eternity. I remember years ago, I was in another state a long time ago, and this was back in my super arrogant days. I'm sure I'm still too arrogant, but I was really arrogant before. And a couple came to see me during the break and said, "Could we chat with you, Dr. Crabb?" And my thought was, I'd be happy to chat with you, and I'm sure I can be helpful because I'm good at this kind of stuff. And we sat down, and I was prepared to help them. They had mentioned their son was breaking their heart. And I figured, well, I'm going to be able to deal with them on how to be a better parent to this difficult son. We sat down over a table, over lunch, and I said, "Tell me about your struggles with your son," feeling very arrogant that I can handle this. And one of the two, I forget which one it was, maybe the husband, maybe the wife, but the sentence was, "Our son committed suicide last week." That's a problem that can't be solved. There's no way to help that boy now. He's dead. And that humbled me in a way that was profound in my life. I still think about it. It still is very alive in me. And this is 30, 40 years ago. There's some problems that cannot be solved. And none of our problems can be completely solved. I've had so many people over the years, I don't want to say so many, but I have had a number, say, "Oh, Dr. Crabb, you've changed my life." And my thought is, no, don't say that. Maybe I've helped change the direction of your life, but you're still a mess. You've still got struggles. You don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. So in the middle of solving your problems, let's be clear that you have a problem that cannot be solved, but you can have a perspective on it. You can have the reality that you are saved, that you can love somebody else now in the middle of whatever problem you have. If the word solution ever has validity, it's that way. The solution to your problem is the ability to love even when you're hurting. In Brothers Karamazov, Fyodor Dostoevsky, the most classic novel ever written, he was once asked, and this is a mythical character, the spiritual director in the book, in the novel, he was asked, "What is hell?" And his answer was, "Hell is the suffering of being unable to love." If that's the case, then our taste of heaven now is the joy of being able to love even when I'm depressed, even when I have a kidney stone, even when I drive to the hospital to get more chemo, even when, in some cases of folks that are listening right now, I suppose, when your wife, your husband has had an affair, when your child's breaking your heart. Have you lost the ability to love? No, you're a Christian. And the taste of heaven is the ability to pour something alive in you that's alive because of the Holy Spirit, because of the gospel, into somebody else. That produces a sustaining joy that doesn't get rid of the pain, but it supports you through the pain.
Here's kind of a big one. Are anxiety and depression forms of addiction?
Are anxiety and depression forms of addiction? Well, I'd want to explore the roots of the anxiety. I'd want to explore the roots of the addiction. And anxiety, obviously, to put it in simple language, it's a fear that something might happen. Now, if what I'm afraid might happen, in my mind, is an absolute catastrophe, something that can take all joy out of my life, then you're an idolater. And you're addicted to the idol of not having this terrible thing happen to you. When I got the word that I had leukemia back in October, was that a happy phone call? And when my oncologist called me and said, you have leukemia, go to the hospital right away, it's serious, did I jump up with joy? My goodness, what an opportunity to trust God. I didn't like it. I didn't like it one bit. But thanks to the fellow that I was with, a very good friend, Jim, was there. And just being in his presence helped so much because I was able to realize that, God, your hand is somehow all over this. I don't think you've caused my leukemia, but there's something you want to do in me through this. And if I can get a hold of that, then maybe I'm moving in the right direction. If I don't get hold of that, and my anxiety is rooted in a fear that is going to destroy my any happiness in life, I'm an idolater, and I'm addicted to whatever, however I can avoid that terrible thing. And depression, often, again, most simply understood, it's a matter of helplessness. It's a matter of recognizing that I've come to a point where nothing I do can make the difference I want. That's ultimately the definition of depression, where nothing, and I understand there's chemical issues here, there's place for medication for that. I have no problem with antidepressant medication, but do understand that the root problem is not going to be solved by the medication, because there really is something in depression that says that I'm helpless to get what I really, really want. Well, what is it you want? And if what you want is not to glorify God, what you really want is not to delight him. If what you really want is not to live for him by loving others, if you really want something more than all the things that we as Christians really do want, then we're idolaters and we're back to an addictive process. And it's this addictive process that is beneath so many of the things we call psychological problems. And in that respect, I think we can say that anxiety and depression, some forms at least, have significant issues with this addictive process beneath the surface.
Larry, you talked about prayer during your presentation, and you modeled briefly for us some model of that, of what it means to pray. How does that actually work in changing our hearts? And what do you think is going on in our hearts when we admit to lustful desires and yet ask God to help us wait for him and the ultimate fulfillment of our desires?
Say that one more time so I can make sure I get it.
You talked about prayer.
Yeah.
Presentation, and you modeled some prayer briefly for us. And so how does that really work? How does that change our hearts? What's going on in our hearts when we admit to lustful desires and yet ask God to help us wait for him as we desire him and look to fulfill our ultimate desire?
The one sentence answer to that, which is inadequate, but it'll get us in the right direction. The one sentence answer to that is that kind of prayer that I was talking about and trying to model a little bit. It opens our heart for the Spirit to move into it. We have a crust around our hearts. The crust is pride. The crust is self-reliance. We have this crust around our hearts. And until that crust is broken open, then the Spirit is quenched. The Spirit is grieved. And as long as the Spirit is quenched or grieved, as long as we keep him out by keeping that crust around our heart, the crust of, well, I've got to be able to handle this. Well, this has to be different. And God, why aren't you helping me? All that reflects the crust around your heart. You're not really speaking to the deepest part of your soul. And when all you want to do then is to somehow um, not worry about praying and just get your problem solved and get to feeling better, you're just rearranging the flesh. You're not making room for the spirit. But when you pray, the kind of prayer I was talking about, Lord, there's a desire in me right now, and it doesn't come from you. You've just opened a door to your heart for the Spirit to enter. And when the lust has conceived and you're just really inclined to go in that direction, you say, Lord, there's a battle going on in my soul right now, and I acknowledge it. God, I want to wait for heaven for my deepest joy. I don't want to demand it now by giving in to this desire that I know is ungodly and unholy. As you pray that prayer, your heart has gotten soft. The door has opened. The Spirit now has access that he didn't have when he was grieved or quenched. And then absolutely when we've sinned and haven't prayed those first two prayers in any way at all, when we've sinned, are we just kind of stuck there for the rest of our lives as just guilty people who make a mess and we're going to sin again tomorrow? And what's the point of even trying to live the Christian life? No, not at all. When our prayer is, Lord, I come to you humbled and broken, a broken man, a broken woman, broken over not their hurt, not their pain, but broken over their sin, that opens their soul to the work of the Spirit. And how the Spirit works, that's not something for me to explain because I don't know. He does his thing. He's God. He's sovereign. But it's my job to open my soul. And those prayers open the heart, open the soul to the work of the Spirit. And what happens, and I've experienced this. If we had an hour, I could tell you some stories. I've experienced in that kind of prayer to sense a lightness within my soul, to sense a desire for the Lord, that an appetite for him that wasn't as strong before I prayed. The Spirit was doing his work. And that can be thrilling. And when that goes on, you just find yourself wanting to sing the doxology. Praise God to whom all, forget how it goes. But you want to just pray. You want to just love the Lord.
Larry, how would you define the experience of joy? And can you give us an example of what that experience looks like in your life?
For me, my understanding of the word joy in this life, and I think it's going to be complete in the next life, incomplete in this life. What I mean by incomplete joy. Joy in this life doesn't eliminate sorrow. Joy in this life is a sustaining of the will to keep on moving towards the Lord and trusting him and giving your life more and more to him. The joy that I experience is the joy of believing that all this Christian stuff is really true and that there is an ability within me to actually move toward another person. And when I do that, I'm living out the reality of who I am as a Christian man. And the degree to which I'm living out that reality, I experience, whether you call it a lightness, whether you call it a hopefulness, but what happens is you are sustained then through whatever the difficulties of life might be. And it's the sustaining, which I would define as the joy. I don't think that we're sustained by our experience of God so much as we're sustained by the truth of God. Because we don't experience God all that deeply. I don't, at least. I'm sure some Christians know a lot more about that than I do. But to experience the presence of God in a totally consuming way, I know that a little bit, but I wish I knew it every day. I don't. But what I'm sustained by is the joy. Surprised by joy, Lewis talked about. Surprised by the joy that there's something in my soul that actually wants to keep moving toward God, even when it seems like he's let me down, even when it seems he hasn't dealt with me in ways I want to be dealt with. But when I understand what he did on the cross for me, when I understand who I am as a Christian, then I'm sustained by the fact that I now have the ability to be there for somebody else. That's the joy of the Christian life until we get to heaven. And then heaven is that on steroids. And it's going to be experiencing the presence of Jesus in a way we can never experience it fully in this world.
Larry, I sometimes feel like I'm trying to endure or outlast my temptation until heaven. Any thoughts on a vision for now while I wait?
Well, you make me think of a verse I think I might have quoted last week, Colossians 1:11, where the Apostle Paul says, one of my favorite verses, I got a bunch of them, but this is one that certainly ranks up close to the top. Paul says that, I want you to know the mighty power of God to do what? To overcome your addiction? Well, it's not what he says, actually. I want you to know the mighty power of God to endure and be patient. Now, what does that mean? Are we supposed to resign ourselves to failure in our addictive struggles? Of course not. But are we to endure them as something that is true of our fallen condition, which every time the addictive strength gets the best of us, what an opportunity for humility. What an opportunity for a greater level of dependence as opposed to quitting and giving up on God and thinking he's failed us. So to endure is to keep moving, and to be patient, it seems to me, is to be patient with the work of the Spirit. Sometimes I wonder, God, just take me home now, for crying out loud. I mean, I can get over all my struggles now. Why don't you take all of us home right now? Come back today, for goodness sakes. Make everybody happy. And he says, no, I got a different story that I'm telling. And it's like, I don't even like your story sometimes, God. And he says, well, the story I tell is the best one. Trust me for it. And the story includes the ability to endure even your failures, as well as the temptations that you wish weren't there, to endure because you have a clear, firm hope that the temptation you're struggling with, the temptation you're yielding to, does not define you as a Christian person. So you can endure it knowing that there's something deeper in you than this ungodly and unholy desire. That doesn't define you. You're a Christian. The Spirit of God is within you. You have an appetite for God that you never had before you became a Christian. The appetite is there, maybe unfelt much of the time, but it's there. And so you endure on the basis of what you know to be true in the gospel, and you're patient with the work of God, which feels so slow to us. But at age 74, I could tell some stories, and anybody with some age behind them could tell them, and younger folks could tell them too, I suppose, that the endurance of a lot of difficulties have led, to perfection? Not even close. But they've led to stability. They've led to a willingness to be able to go forward, knowing that I'm a broken man and knowing that I fail sometimes miserably. And that means I can't be defeated. And that feels like a wonderful side effect, if you will, of enduring and learning what it means to be patient, as you know that the heaven's coming up.
Thanks for that. How does the reality of the fact that we're new creations when we've accepted Christ as our Savior, how does that get integrated into our struggles with our desire for self-protection and for self-gratification?
Well, the new creation, we're new creation. That's simply, you're talking about new covenant theology. And the covenant that God has made, Jeremiah 31 talks about it, Ezekiel 36 talks about it, where there's a new covenant, which means there's a new arrangement between me and God has put within me an appetite for him that wasn't there before, as I just said a minute ago. He's also given me a new purity, that even at my worst, when I fail egregiously, that doesn't disqualify me from being God's beloved. I'm still deeply loved. There's nothing I can do to make him love me less. So it seems to me that when I understand what it is to be loved, when I understand what it is to move forward, even when I fail, that maybe there's some hope in all of that. I'm not sure if I'm responding to your question, but it's the best I can do for the moment.
I think you did. How would I cultivate the desire for and the connection to God's larger story?
Well, a simple answer that can sound simplistic. How much time are you spending in the Bible? How much time do you spend meditating? Not just studying, certainly studying. I'm all for the study of God's Word with the help of scholars, commentators, of course. But how much time do you just spend time meditating? Even in preparation for this webinar today, I wanted to have a desire that was stronger than my desire for this webinar to go well. I wanted to have a desire that was stronger than for me to be coherent as I talk too fast. I wanted to have a desire for something stronger. And I just found myself sitting for a few moments and just pondering and meditating. What is most alive in me? Can I think about the thirst that is going on in me? Can I think about the scriptures? And I think about that passage in James, which was on my mind strongly just this morning, James 1:15, about lust when it's conceived brings forth sin. If we spend time in the Word, if we spend time meditating, and thirdly, spend time in the Word studying, spend time in the Word meditating, but then thirdly, what does it mean to get feedback from other people? Something that I haven't really emphasized for a while, but I think is crucial. Do I know what it means to say to somebody, tell me how I impact you? And when I realize that I impact, whether it's my wife, whether it's my sons, whether it's my grandchildren, whether it's good friends, when I impact them by trying to be impressive or trying to let them know how much I know or letting my pride rule how I relate to them, I discover when I realize how I've failed somebody, how I've hurt somebody, that I really have a thirst for something better. My wife and I had a wonderful time with two very close friends just a couple of nights ago. And one of the things that I said to them when the evening was coming to a close, they were sharing some very honest, real struggles, very godly people. And my concern was, have I been sitting here trying to play Dr. Crabb as opposed to a brother to these two wonderful friends? As I tried to impress them with coming up with a wonderful insight that they'd be able to say, "Oh wow, Larry, how did you think of that?" Well, I don't live beyond that. That's in me. But when I asked them for feedback, the feedback that I got was much more positive. That they didn't feel like I was demanding that I be helpful, but that I was simply with them, giving whatever I had that maybe came from the Spirit of God. And when they gave me that kind of affirmation, which of course I enjoyed, but it strengthened my awareness of the thirst that I have. That's what I want. My thirst is to know the Lord more deeply and to impact others the way I want, but I'm not going to do it perfectly. Oh, I can't wait for heaven when I'm going to do it so much better than I can ever do it now.
When did you, in your smaller story, first become aware of the battle going on in your soul?
Huh. You got an hour?
I got all the time you need.
Yeah, right. I don't have an hour, I'm afraid.
I can talk to you after we finish this thing.
Yeah, right, exactly. And I'd enjoy that too. But let me just ponder, because the question's good. When did I first become aware? How did you put it? First become aware of the larger story, or the smaller story, where there's a real struggle going on? Huh. I think it was pretty early on. But what occurs to me, and I could go earlier days than this, but during my teenage years, I had a number of struggles, two that I'm willing to share, some I'm not willing to share. But one was I was a very bad stutterer, and another was that I had a lot of pimples. And neither stuttering nor pimples were particularly in my youth group, as I've often said. And it felt to me that, God, why can't you let me get over this? I remember reading the passage in the Bible with Moses when he said, well, I can't talk. Maybe he was a stutterer. And God wanted him to go to Pharaoh and get people to deliver out of Egypt, the Israelites out of Egypt. And he said, I'm not sure I can even talk. And God says, I'll be with your mouth. And I can't tell you the number of times that when I got up in teenage years and I had to speak in a class in high school, whatever, and I was afraid I was going to stutter, then I would say, Lord, be with my mouth. And sometimes he wasn't. And sometimes I stuttered and I made a fool of myself. And I've had a lot of experiences of making a fool of myself. One time in front of 800 people when I had to repeat the vow to become president of my junior high school. And I couldn't say my name and I couldn't say the name of the school. And 800 kids laughed at me. And that was a miserable moment in my life. And I just became very aware of the battle. The battle was, God, I don't think I want anything to do with you. You're failing me miserably. But I also know that I'm a sinner and you saved me, so I don't want to get rid of you entirely, but could you be a little more useful to me? And I think I became aware of the battle between the flesh and the spirit in that particular time, even to the point where in the end of my teenage years, as I was moving toward graduate school, I really chose to abandon Christianity insofar as I knew how to do that, because God's, as I understood Christianity, it wasn't doing for me what I thought Christianity should do. So I turned to psychology for help that Christianity didn't offer. And then over time, I came to realize I did not know much about Christianity, as my deepest problem he's dealing with. And even my lesser problems, stuttering, pimples, whatever, a different perspective on them that can keep me sustained and moving toward others in spite of liabilities that I wish I didn't have. But those liabilities don't have to prevent me from being the person I most long to be. The battle began to become clear to me in teenage years when my understanding of Christianity failed me.
I've heard that story before.
Yeah.
Do addictions present themselves differently between men and women? And how do addictions affect masculinity and femininity?
That's a question that really would require more time than I have. But I would say very simply, and to put some more meat to what I'm going to say very briefly here, a book that I wrote called Fully Alive, dealing with masculinity and femininity would maybe be the background context for what I want to say. But I do believe that men and women have a different core terror. The core terror of a woman, it seems to me, and I have some biblical basis for this that might be weak, might be strong, but it seems strong to me, that the core terror of a woman has much more to do with, does anybody see me? Invisibility. I just don't know if anybody looks at me and with desire wants to move toward me. And I'm not talking about sexual inappropriate desire, but a desire to be with a woman that's at her soul level is so beautiful. And if nobody has ever seen me, then the terror is very real. And for the man, the terror is less a matter of being seen, although I'm sure it's overlapping in both genders. But for a man is, do I make a difference? Is there anything in me that can impact another person? So I think while we all share the same terrors at some level, there's a center to the terror for a woman. And I think the addiction then can become, how do I display myself so I can draw somebody to me? And of course, there's obvious ways in our culture a woman can dress inappropriately and make sure that her hair is always perfect, or maybe she uses her sense of humor, maybe she uses her caringness for other people, all kinds of ways that a woman can say, see me, see me, see me. And she becomes addicted to whatever strategy she has for being seen. And for a guy, how can I make an impact? Well, over the years, I tend to be funny sometimes. Even this morning, as I was in the hospital not getting chemo this morning, but still there for a couple hours and talking to a couple nurses. And I was joking with him, and one of the nurses said to me, "You're a comedian." And I found myself thinking, yeah, I like my sense of humor, and sometimes I can be kind of funny. But there's something in me that says, yeah, I use my sense of humor to make sure that I make an impact on you so you really like me and respect me and think I'm pretty good at this. Or maybe over the years I've developed a good vocabulary because I'm a writer. And sometimes I'll think of a really big word that I get a kick out of using, knowing that somebody else probably hasn't heard it. And I think that my addiction then is to impressing people with whatever I have to impress them with, whether it's a sense of humor, whether it's big words, whatever it might be. So I think there's that kind of a distinction. A woman wants to be noticed, and she'll do whatever it takes to be noticed. A man wants to make a difference. He'll do whatever it takes to feel like he's being recognized for the impact that he has. Those are two general thoughts. I wouldn't pin myself down to those, but I think they're in the ballpark.
I think we've got time for one more question, Dad. This is one that I looked at that I thought.
I think chemo brain is setting in, but let's give one more try.
One more question, and then we'll let you go. And thanks again for this time, Pop. I really appreciate that. It seems as if suicide is really on the rise now, even among Christians. Do you have any thoughts on that this has anything to do with not getting in touch with our longings or the hope of the second coming, and that we're looking for complete satisfaction here instead of waiting for what's to come?
The way that person phrased the question includes the answer to it. Yeah. And I think that's very well put. Yeah, I do think that the kind of thinking that goes into the suicide ideation, ways of thinking, it really boils down to hopelessness. We go to the Billy Graham Training Center pretty often. I'll be there in a couple of weeks, a little less than a week actually. And he has one of his quotes lining the halls of the Billy Graham Training Center, the Cove in Asheville, North Carolina. He says, "I don't see how anybody can live without hope." And I think that's true, because this world is so disappointing. We look in a mirror and we're so disappointed in a variety of ways that unless we have a hope that means something to us in the center of our soul, then there really is struggle there. And I really do think that what the person said in their question really was the answer to it, that when there really is the ultimate hope of someday all the difficulties now that really feel profoundly unbearable, but if there's a hope that the day is coming and the Lord's going to take me home at some point, so I'm not going to take my own life. I'm not going to end my existence now, because maybe there's something going on. Is he working in this larger story? One of my favorite lines about the larger story, that the larger story is unfolding in your life, no matter what you're going through. That's a hopeful sentence. The larger story that I'm thirsty to tell, because it's a story of joy, it's a story of love, it's a story of fulfillment. That's the story, that's the larger story that culminates in all of those wonderful realities. And in the meantime, what has to happen within me is to be aware that that story is unfolding in me right now, as I drive to the hospital to get more chemo, as I go to the dentist to see if I have cavities again, as I look at my bank account and wish I had more money, that in the middle of all the things that are going on in my life and in your life, the larger story is unfolding in every moment. And that's the basis for hope. That's why the larger story is just one of my very favorite phrases. Kep, as I know it is one of yours as well. The larger story is the story God is telling. And the smaller story is a story that I foolishly think he should be telling, and he's not. And that frustrates me until I get my mind wrapped around the goodness of God revealed in Calvary. Then I can realize if I live in between the cross and all that he's done for me and the coming, all he is yet going to do for me, then hope can sustain me through the worst of times.